Okay, so I think we're recording now. Um, Thanks a lot for being here with us, Peter. Today we're very lucky to have Dr. Peter Bentley with us on the podcast. Peter is a British author and computer scientist based at University College London. He is an honorary professor and teaching fellow at UCL and a visiting professor at Autodesk, the multinational software corporation that makes software products and services for architecture, engineering, construction, etc. Peter's research interests include evolutionary computation, artificial life, swarm intelligence, artificial immune systems, artificial neural nets, and other types of biologically inspired computing, which he terms digital biology. Peter also has a prolific writing career, having published a few books, including his most recent one, 10 Short Lessons in Artificial Intelligence and Robotics. So thanks for being with us today, Peter.
That's my pleasure.
So when I was just introducing your research interests, a lot of it has to do with evolutionary computation. And I wanted to ask you to sort of start this off. Recently, there has been a lot of attention surrounding the types of AI that we see in the news nowadays, even in mainstream media, such as supervised learning, unsupervised learning, reinforcement learning. Would you classify evolutionary computation and what you term biologically inspired computing under any of those branches? And why do you think it's not getting the same amount of attention as the others?
Well, that's a slightly loaded question, isn't it? Well, let's see. How would I classify it? We traditionally evolutionary computation was not seen as a machine learning method. It was seen more as an optimizer method. And I suppose in more recent years, it's become used more even as an exploration method. So, variants such as novelty search have started to become in vogue, where it's not even so much exploring as optimizing as exploring. So, but if you want to use it for learning, you can, of course, and you can frame evolution as a kind of way of learning things. And yeah, it could be supervised, it could be unsupervised. It depends on how you set it up. You can, if you have an explicit, like genetic programming, if you have a very specific kind of target in your objective function, it could be seen as being supervised. Or if it's more a modeling system such as artificial life, where there's no explicit fitness function, things just have to survive, then you could see that as unsupervised learning. As to why it's not in vogue, well, yeah, I think the answer is more why the other branches are in vogue, and I think that's perhaps because there have been a few algorithmic breakthroughs in terms of efficiency of learning, combined with the use of GPUs and other accelerated hardware that really enable, I suppose also combined with a huge amount of data. So those things combined enabled machine learning really to achieve breakthroughs that before then had seemed really quite difficult. Now, we've not had quite the same sort of innovations in my old field, evolutionary computation. We are having some innovations in the algorithms, but nothing quite so transformative, perhaps, in terms of efficiency of computation. And although some people are looking at improving the use of accelerated hardware for evolutionary computation, we haven't seen that to quite the same extent. And also because evolutionary computation is typically not reliant on data in the same way that machine learning is, the fact that we now have access to vast amounts of data hasn't had the same impact to evolutionary computation than it did in machine learning. So as a result, let's say I wouldn't say it's not in vogue. I'd just say it's kind of more or less where it always has been, and machine learning has just gone nuts. And to the point that, and you can look at the attendance of conferences to see that, NeurIPS is now crazy high numbers compared to what it used to be. So I guess that's my that's my take on it.
Yeah. Reza, were you gonna say something?
Oh, before we go further, could you kind of briefly define what an evolutionary process is?
Well, okay. Let me just hang on a sec. My computer is suddenly popping things up and interrupting me. So,
No worries.
No worries.
Okay, I'm going to have to cancel a whole bunch of stuff that's just getting really in the way. It's decided it wants to do an upgrade. Okay, go away. Right, do you want to ask that question again?
Sure. Yeah, just before we go further, could you briefly define what an evolutionary process is?
Sure. So for me, I like to think of evolution, and I guess I'm not the only one. I guess Richard Dawkins came up with something similar, but I consider an evolutionary process to be reliant on certain fundamental principles. So one is inheritance. So you've got to have reproduction with inheritance such that the kids must resemble the parents to a certain amount. You've got to have variation so that the kids are not identical copies to parents. And you've got to have selection. That is, some survive more or less than others. So this is quite a detailed description of what an evolutionary process is. But if you've got reproduction with inheritance, some variation, and some selection, then as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't matter what medium this is happening in, whether it's in a computer or whether it's in a biological system, or maybe whether it's in the kind of notion of memes and ideas. If you've got these things going on, then you've got an evolutionary process.
So with evolutionary computation, you essentially digitally simulate the evolutionary process to achieve some end goal.
Well, I would say it's real evolution. You don't have to simulate the evolution, but what we might do is simulate some kind of sense of a gene or a genotype. We might simulate the way proteins interact or that kind of thing. But for me, we're not simulating evolution any more than machine learning simulates learning. Machine learning actually learns. It could be said to simulate the way a brain works. So for me, a genetic algorithm really does evolve stuff. But how you set it up might be simulating, might not be.
In the kind of 2 questions ago, you made a comment about the fact that it seems that evolutionary algorithms don't scale with data availability as much as, say, other machine learning algorithms. Could you expand on that a little?
Well, we don't have backprop in genetic algorithms. So, genetic algorithms use this process of evolution, and without doing some kind of, let's say, messing with it, your standard way of doing evolution is you have a whole bunch of individuals, a population of them, and out of necessity, you've got to evaluate all of them, and then you've got to make new versions of some of them, and then you've got to evaluate all of them again. And it's very hard to speed that up. You can speed it up by substituting a true evaluation with some kind of surrogate, and maybe the surrogate is faster to calculate, but which is a common way of doing it. But yeah, the fundamental part of evolution is it requires this much testing, because if you like, that's what evolution is. It's a very, very parallel testing regime. I wouldn't say it's exhaustive, because certainly natural evolution shows us just how clever it can be, and you can have very directed changes that are made and that are even permitted. And that's one of the clever things about natural evolution, the way that, if you like, evolution has learnt how to evolve. So our DNA is, let's say our DNA contains 3.5, 3.6 billion years of lessons learnt through unthinkable numbers of creatures as they've fought to survive. And those lessons are written into the very structure of our genetic code. Now, we don't know those lessons. And so creating something similar for a genetic algorithm, we're not so good at that. But because natural evolution has done that, it means that most of the time when organisms reproduce, you get a viable organism, something that is still an organism. It still survives, it lives, despite being a potentially entirely novel combination of genetic material from these two parents with some random variation that never existed before. It still can live, and it can still exist and solve all the problems it needs to and find mates and reproduce itself. So the fact that we have this amazing representation, this genetic representation, is a marvel. And I suppose not forgetting the factory that surrounds it, which is the cell, because of course we don't just inherit our genes from our parents, we inherit the cell. So all of this is a remarkable amount of machinery that, I suspect if we could understand it better, if we could maybe even learn some of it, maybe that would be the kind of transformative breakthrough that evolutionary computation might need, then to propel it in the same way that machine learning has been propelled. But yes, data doesn't drive evolution in that way unless you were to use data to create this kind of representation first. But no one's done that yet. So, creating the genetic representation has always been something of an art form in genetic algorithms. And I suppose what I'm proposing is maybe we need a way of automating that representation creation, just as the breakthrough in machine learning kind of removed the need for feature selection and made it so much easier to apply machine learning to almost anything. So that's, let's say, a breakthrough waiting to happen.
By selecting representation, do you mean the, say, parameterization of the things you're evolving, kind of the function that turns some genotype into a phenotype? Or
yes, kind of. But the way I think of it is, just parameterizing. Let's say I'm evolving a design. Let's say it's a table. I'm evolving a table design, and my parameters naively could be. I'm going to have 4 legs, so they're going to be the length of the 4 legs, and it's going to be the width and the depth of the tabletop. Okay, so I've got basically 3 parameters. That's a really naive way of doing it, and all I can do is optimize 4-legged tables, and they're all going to look much the same, and you're not going to achieve very much.
Right.
You can do it, and it'll work. But far more interestingly is actually to use evolution in the way that it happens in nature, and that's more of a kind of generative process. And if you were to do that, and actually this is where my PhD was about 25 years ago, I showed that you don't just parameterize designs, you give it the equivalent of a virtual bucket of bricks, and you say, okay, pick whatever block that you want, change its size if you want to, glue it together in any way you want to, make me a table out of these virtual blocks. And then it has complete creativity and it can do what it wants. So no longer are you kind of parameterizing an existing solution. You're saying, build me a novel solution out of components, which is, again, is pretty much what happens in nature, because nature builds novel organisms out of components such as cells. So then... let me just carry on. So then genes become not a parameterization; they become akin to, in biological development, more a recipe, more a set of instructions of how you choose these building blocks, how you combine them, what you do with them. And because it's a recipe, because it's a process, you can then build in those lessons that I was talking about earlier. And those lessons include not just evolvability, how you can and should change certain bits of this representation in the future, but also whether you should repair some bits. So if some bits have been mutated, and they really shouldn't be, because they're absolutely essential, like you've got a table and it's got one leg in a corner, and well, there's no point having a one-legged table in a corner because it's just going to fall over. You've got to repair that, and therefore you've got to make it support itself. That's a rather naive example, but you get what I mean. So we're talking about much more complex kinds of uses of evolution. And the advantage of having a more complex mapping from a genotype to a phenotype is that this mapping process, this developmental or morphogenesis or whatever you want to call it process, allows you to build in things like constraints as well. So typically most solutions are heavily constrained in the real world. You can actually have a much kind of freer representation as a genotype, and then as it develops, its environment will impact on it, and it will automatically satisfy constraints by the time you've got the finished solution. So very powerful methods. And again, you see that in living organisms. We're the shape we are not because of our genes purely, but because we interacted with the environment that we have. And we know full well, and of course this very much applies for the brain as well, if we grow up, if we develop in an environment that is entirely abnormal, unfortunately we will be abnormal. Our brains will not develop appropriately, our bodies may not develop appropriately. And if anyone was foolish enough to try and raise a child in microgravity or zero gravity, it wouldn't do well. Its musculature, its skeleton would not be good at all.
Thanks for that, Peter. Given that the evolutionary computation seems so powerful, it can evolve not just tables but whole humans and other living creatures. Would you say there's any sort of limit to it? Is there anything it can't evolve? Like I remember reading this article recently talking about the really funny question of why don't we see wheels in any living creatures? Like, is there any sort of things that can't evolve?
Well, so evolution, if you like, is limited to what it can get its metaphoric hands on. And so, in other words, whatever its representation is, whatever its building blocks comprise, and whatever the constraints of that evolutionary process are that enables it to exist. So in other words, in biological evolution, it uses protein as the main molecular building block, if you like. So cells communicate by proteins, genes produce proteins, everything is really protein. Obviously, natural evolution has some significant constraints in that living organisms need to live in order to reproduce, and they have to be able to process all nutrients in their environments and in such a way to turn them into proteins such that they can continue to exist. So, effectively, natural evolution, therefore, has a very specific kind of building blocks to play with, and it has to use them to the best of its ability, if you like. So yeah, in the natural world, it's very difficult to, not impossible, but it's very difficult and let's say unlikely for some solutions to be found compared to others. But if we were to use the same processes with different constraints and with different building blocks, then we can evolve radically different things. So you see this, and not just in evolution, you see this in almost any man-made kind of generative system. Whatever representation you give it kind of predetermines the style, almost, the kind of things that can be created. And no matter what man-made sort of generative process that we've come up with so far, I can't think of one that is entirely unconstrained. I think,
Right.
it's almost, I'm speaking in English, and the building blocks, the words, the letters, the nuances that I'm using are in some respects enabled by the language English, but in other respects they're constrained. And there are certain things that I could say much more simply in other languages. And that's not to say that am I now suggesting that there are some things I can't say in English? Well, mate, I don't know if that's true or not. Some might argue.
I think it's more likely.
Yeah. So certainly it's a lot easier for us to say some things in English, and it's a lot more difficult to say other things in English. And I've got a Chinese friend who claims that counting in Mandarin is much better because it's shorter words. So you can, so you can count quicker. But I don't know if that's true or not. But, so... But I think it is very much...
Yeah, I see what you mean.
It's very much sort of representation dependent. And that's not really anything to do with the algorithm. That's to do with the building blocks that we use.
Mm-hmm. So in the case of the wheels, it was like the natural environment around us is the constraints, and the building blocks are, the matter that this universe just happened to, or the Earth
I think
was given with.
I think it's, well, to some extent, but also, given this planet Earth, are the biological organisms that we see today the only possible ones? I don't think that's necessarily true. It's just that the specific building blocks that natural evolution has to play with are things like proteins and cells, because those are the kind of ideas, if you like, that were invented very early on at the birth of life. Had some other weird invention come about, maybe not using quite the same approaches, and we, in the animal kingdom, or the phylogeny of life on Earth, there are certainly some variants that look a little bit different, but not that different. But yeah, in terms of building blocks, it's theoretically not impossible for the same planet to have different building blocks. So yeah, it's an interesting question.
Mm-hmm. But okay, now it's just to ask like a pretty sort of more meta question. Since there's no theoretical limit on what evolution as an algorithm can evolve, and given that one of the most desirable things that we're looking to solve right now is intelligence, and we've seen, because we are the proof of concept of it, that evolution has evolved general intelligence, why aren't we trying to simulate that again in a digital environment over an intelligence we can control?
Well, I think some people are, but it depends what you mean by intelligence, doesn't it? I mean, and it depends what you mean by general intelligence. You see, I'm not so sort of I'm not so selective in my definition of intelligence. I would regard, let's say, well, actually, most forms of life are actually remarkably intelligent in the way that they behave in response to the challenges that they face. And just because many of them don't have neurons doesn't mean that their behavior isn't intelligent and isn't perfectly suited to their environments. So, you could perfectly well argue that an ivy plant intelligently seeks out light and changes its morphology in a really clever, adaptive way. Let me put it this way. If we had a robot that could behave like an ivy plant and completely radically change its morphology in response to its environment, keep itself fed through its own means, could photosynthesize, could generate energy by carefully shaping itself. I think we'd call that a really advanced form of AI. And the fact that it doesn't have any neurons and it doesn't have anything resembling a brain doesn't mean that it's not clever. I think it is clever. And equally, an ant colony, which is a very commonly picked example, it clearly has a kind of intelligence. And yes, there are a bunch of neurons, and the neurons in this case are spread across an awful lot of different ants. But the way a colony as a whole responds to challenges and changes, and in some respects, some cases, it can pack up the entire colony and move everything lock, stock, and barrel, and form bridges over barriers, and then create a new colony. Or indeed, other types can make entire kind of cities and amazing architecture. That's clever, right? Again, if we had robots that could do that, that would blow every kind of AI robot out of the water that we have. And we would have papers writing about the amazing AI social robots that we've got. So, I don't know, so your question was, can we use evolution in a computer to do such things? Well, from those respects, we are doing, and we have done for many years, and we still are today. We do have evolved robot systems. We do have evolved solutions that create different kinds of intelligence. If you're asking a different question, why aren't we trying to evolve something that looks like a human brain? Then I'd say that's kind of like, I don't know, how can I put this as an analogy? It's almost like kind of saying, well, I'm going to try and breed a human that can paint like Picasso. Why does it have to paint like Picasso? Why does it have to be specific? But, why does it have to be a human brain?
Right.
I mean,
I guess I was asking more along the lines of why can't we evolve general intelligence? And I guess the distinction that term implies is, general instead of the narrow AI that we see in algorithms like AlphaGo. So an AI that does remarkably well in one thing, but it can't learn another thing because it'll forget the previous thing. Or like the best self-driving car maybe can drive better than any pedestrian. I mean, any civilian driver. But he can't beat a 3-year-old at tic-tac-toe or something. So these are all examples of narrow AI that are remarkable at just one thing.
But again, I think the whole goal of so-called general intelligence is often a somewhat spurious and misplaced goal, because look, intelligence exists in living systems in order to enable those living creatures to solve the problems that they need to solve, right? The ivy plant doesn't have a brain because it doesn't need a brain. It doesn't need to respond in a very short time frame to its challenges. Its challenges are at the time scale of growing, which is why it can get away with a different kind of mechanism for its cleverness. Which is much more to do with communication at a chemical level between lots of cells. And there are other kinds of intelligence, such as our own immune systems, which I think are just as clever as our brains in many respects. But our immune systems have different kinds of challenges, which really occur in a more sort of chemical domain, a molecular domain, which is why our immune systems are kind of chemically wired up to address those. Why would you give a washing machine the ability to think deep thoughts like Socrates? Why would you need a robot to have more cognitive abilities than it needs in order to solve the problems that it's likely to face? That, there's a reason why anything should have a brain that it does. And so to put it the other way, how would I get something with the adaptability of a human brain? How would I get that so-called general intelligence that humans have supposedly got? And looking at what we're doing to the planet, you've really got to wonder how clever we are, by the way, because I don't think we're that clever. We're basically destroying our entire single environment. And some of our richest people, by the way, are rather than solving the problem, are pushing money into going to Mars, which I think it's great to go to Mars, but I think there are higher priorities right now because we are screwing our planet. How would we create such an intelligence as a human being? Well, you create intelligence by making that entity face the same kinds of challenges, putting it in as varied as environment, making it need to solve those problems. A Tesla car doesn't need general thought unless it really starts to face a lot more complex problems. And of course, one could argue, well, it already does. It really, a self-driving car should be thinking, morally, who should I be trying to avoid when I've got a potential accident coming along? It's not capable of it. It's not likely to be capable of it, which is why obviously autonomous cars are not ever really going to be, or not for a long time, going to be able to cope in fully autonomous mode, not even counting the fact that our environments change so quickly and radically that despite the best efforts of machine learning, autonomous vehicles are just not going to keep up, and accidents will keep happening. And we are just better at that kind of thing. But yeah, how do we create this general intelligence? You've got to make it so that it is necessary. And, the reason why human beings have the brains that we do is not because that we need to play tic-tac-toe, or we need to play computer games, or we need to be able to juggle and tap dance and sing songs and do a lot of other silly things. Not saying that silly songs is silly, but we have the brains that we have because of our evolutionary history, right? Because we were once little rodent things that had to avoid being eaten, and so we had to think fast, and we had to have adaptive senses and good reactions. Before that, we used to be swimming in some ancient ocean. We had to have good coordination. We had to have other aspects. More recently, we decided we wanted to, well, I suppose, let's say it was advantageous once we figured out how to walk and move around. And this is all supposition, by the way. I'm making assumptions because no one really knows. But, we discovered that having the ability to eat more variety and hunt more complex things enabled us to survive in more various environments that enabled our species to spread a little bit more. So at every stage, there were challenges. So literally life and death challenges that meant that for us as a species, having an extra thing stuck in this grey matter was useful. An addition to the visual centers, an addition to the cognitive bit here, an addition to a memory here. Whilst, of course, sometimes atrophying other areas. I mean, some of our ancestors were no doubt much better at us at thinking in some ways or sensing in some ways. We've decided to, or we've evolved these kinds of additions to our brains because we had to. It was never a choice. It was never that, wouldn't it be great if we were really clever and we could do a lot of stuff? It was we either do this or we're dead. And again, we didn't choose that either. It was, to rephrase it in a slightly more accurate way, it was, okay, I managed to survive because I was just a little bit quicker of thought in that respect, or I was just a little bit better at understanding that sensory input. And unfortunately, my brothers and sisters died because they weren't as good as that. So, it's pure necessity that drives intelligence of whatever form that intelligence takes. And therefore, to say we want a general intelligence with no mention of the environment and the tasks for which that intelligence is designed is omitting half the picture. In fact, it's probably omitting more than half the picture, because it's the environment, that's what shapes us, that's what makes us who we are, that's what builds our intelligence. So that's my answer.
One of the interesting things in that kind of incredible story you just told of, from the oceans into rodents and stuff, is that we seem to keep evolving out of our environmental niches. Or,
well, I'm not sure it's not like we're the crazy ones in the big family tree of Earth life. All life does this. It's just that sometimes things change, right? So sometimes, as we're doing right now to our planet, there's some environmental change which just necessitates the survival of some rather than others. The oceans warm, a big comet lands, a big volcano explodes. Or sometimes there's a little evolutionary breakthrough. Sometimes there's a new little combination of organisms that by chance kind of start to collaborate, and they start to co-evolve, and then they start gluing themselves together, and lo and behold, you've got first the invention of the cell, and then you've got the invention of multicellularity. And then they start to, so by some weird random chance, when they're ingesting a certain other creature, little deposits start forming within them, and before you know it, you've got the invention of bones. And all of this is just kind of random chance, but once these little evolutionary breakthroughs happen, it can open up a whole new niche, a whole new family of possibilities. And going back to what we were saying earlier, it's almost like inventing new building blocks. Nature sometimes stumbles across these new ways of making stuff, of putting things together. And every time, give a kid a new set. You go from Lego to, I used to play with Meccano. I thought Meccano was brilliant when I was little. Well, you give a kid a Meccano set after Lego, and suddenly they can make a whole new set of stuff. Meccano was good because it had motors and other stuff. I suppose Lego has motors these days as well, but
Going back to your discussion on the fact that the general AI goal might actually not be something that we want, then what are your thoughts on labs such as OpenAI and DeepMind, who are pretty, they don't beat around the bush. Their goal is to ultimately achieve the sort of general intelligence. It seems like these labs are getting a lot of funding to do something like this, to sort of pursue that utopian vision for a benevolent AI that you can just ask it whatever it wants and it gives that to you. Is that not do you not share that same vision?
Can I just sort my curtain out? It's getting a little bit sunny here.
No worries.
Okay, so I'm not sure. So I didn't say it's not something. Well, let me put it this way. I didn't say that general intelligence is something that we don't want. I'm not sure whether we need it. Wanting and needing are two different things, right? So lots of people want stuff they don't need. So I don't think we need it, for sure. Lots of people want this kind of general intelligence. But I don't think, as we've kind of been discussing, I don't think they've really thought it through very carefully. Now, number one, they're not going to achieve it. Certainly not by the methods that they're proposing. And that's partly because of number two, and that is they haven't thought about the whole picture. What is it for? Right? A general intelligence can only exist to solve very specific problems. So what problems? What is it actually going to do? I mean, having a big fat brain that just sits there being clever and supposedly solves every problem that you throw at it. Well, why would it solve every problem that you throw at it until you've thrown a lot of problems at this developing AIs to try and force them to solve these things, which is kind of what they're having to do. But I kind of don't understand the reasoning behind it, because they will not understand anything more about how the human brain works, because most of it's engineering. If you look at today's most successful machine learning methods, they're working not because of any real understanding behind things. They're working because of engineering. They're gluing a lot of different things together. They're discovering that often brute force, sheer numbers, sheer scale is hugely successful. But then you see other research papers coming out saying, well, look, you see this monstrous deep learning model, you can get the same accuracy with 3% of the network if you prune it away. Prune away 97% of the network and it's still as accurate. But then you can't train it because it's too small to train. But a biological organism somehow does have tiny, compact, elegant neural networks that are trainable, that do work, and that are efficient. So, I think, to me, the entire motivation is the wrong way around. You shouldn't just randomly try and make a general intelligence with no reason for it. Because, frankly, the amount of resources they're using in these brute force methods is also screwing the planet. It uses a huge amount of energy to train these models, and if that's their approach to creating general intelligence, they're going to be doing this for a long time, and they're going to be using ever more computation resources, to the point that it's going to be the same amount of power as running cities. I'm not exaggerating. Entire cities worth of power will go into these computational resources. For what? What's the result going to be? I mean, we know how to make a general intelligence like a human being. You have a kid, right? That's something that has been known for a long time. But biology is much better at it. So if you must do this, why not do this for a purpose? Either create an intelligence that's actually going to do something useful and solve a problem that needs to be solved, or do it from a scientific perspective and specifically try and understand what intelligence is, or how the brain works, or but unfortunately, and this can be done. And I as you said at the start, I sometimes do research in a field called artificial life, and the point of that, and I work with a lot of biologists actually, so not just that field, but I work a lot with biologists, and we model different biological phenomena, and we do try and understand how biological phenomena work by kind of making a simulation of them. So if we can make something that works on similar principles, then we hope that we'll number one, understand a bit more about the biology, and number two, we might do something that's useful in a more engineering context. But if you talk to the number of machine learning engineers out there who actively even know any biology, it's pretty low, and let alone work with biologists and neurologists, the number is even lower. I mean, some do, and good for you for doing it, but it's not common. And partly it's not common because, frankly, we don't have the faintest idea how the brain works still. The human brain, or any brain, or any biological system, frankly, the more you dig in, the more you discover just how frustratingly complicated it is, and again, going back to what I was saying at the beginning, those 3.5, 3.6 billion years of lessons that are encoded within us, they are not written in living organisms in a human readable form, sadly. So they are written in a complex systems form, such that really, really, really difficult to understand. But for me, that's a motivation for doing it. If you must create an intelligence, start small, for goodness sake. Don't try and create a human. Start with something like an ant or a wasp or a slug or something that's somehow manageable, and slowly work up. I mean, I think we've not only have we fully sequenced the nematode, I think we've gone through its developmental process, so we know exactly where every cell will be placed during its development of the nematode. In theory, we should have the capability, and maybe someone's done this, I haven't looked, but in theory, we've got the capability to model the entirety of a nematode, all of its cells, all of its neurons, all of its sensory inputs, and get the same behavior out. Maybe someone's done that, but that's the kind of work I think we should be doing, and then slowly complexify it, slowly build up the complexity and understand the tricks of how you make brains, how you make intelligence. But you don't do it by trying to make, this is what the guys in the 1950s were trying to do. Say, no, give me a decade and we'll have robots running around doing the washing up and everything will be amazing. They were saying that in the 1950s. And then they said it again in the 1960s and the 70s and the 80s. And guess what? Today, they're saying the same thing. Only today, sadly, we're having billions of dollars pushed into it. And okay, we're getting some really interesting machine learning models out. We're getting some algorithms that can do some interesting things. Are those things necessary? Are those algorithms solving the world's problems? Or are they actually causing quite a lot of problems themselves? Are they now introducing problems such as authenticity? Do we even know whether a photo is real anymore? Do we even know if something has been written by a human or not? Do we know if something is true or not? Do we know if a piece of news is accurate or not? It's amazing we have these capabilities, but how many of these problems have been solved just because a machine learning engineer thought, wouldn't it be cool if I could do that, rather than thinking, there's this problem that needs to be solved. What's the best way of solving the problem? So again, I would say to the AGI researchers, yeah, if you want to do it, but I'd like to see a better justification for it, really. I'd like to see how it's going to make the world a better place.
Does it surprise you that you mentioned things like we read a piece of news and we don't know anymore if a human wrote it or if a program wrote it? Does it surprise you that they have been able to write programs that can, to an extent, kind of mimic, human writing without understanding it?
I have to say, not really, no. But given the amount of data, and knowing what we know about how a simple neural network, because honestly, even the latest, the best deep learning methods, they are trivially simple compared to the way a real biological organism works. Trivially simple. So, but given those simple algorithms and the amount of data that you can push into them, and the size you can make, so algorithmically they're simple. That doesn't mean they're not small. They can, or not big rather. They can be very, very big, stupidly big. So, I'm impressed. I mean, it's great to see it, and I think that the things I find the most fun are things like when you can take a blurry, very low resolution image of a human face, and through deep learning, turn that into a high resolution, very precise face. Of course, a lot of that has been kind of made up, but the fictional parts that have been invented by deep learning are about as accurate as you could make them, because they come from vast numbers of other faces that inform that fiction, if you like. So I think that's great. But what we're talking about really are statistical tricks. It's using vast amounts of data to do these statistical tricks, and it's nice to see them. I like it. They're fun things. In some cases they're more than fun. In some cases they're profound. We could do drug discovery. We can actually create really valuable medicines and breakthroughs like that. But all too often they're not profound. All too often they're just kind of rather trivial use cases. So I don't think it's surprising. I think for the right applications, really valuable, really useful. But I think that kind of applies to all technologies. Whatever the technology, whatever the invention, for the right application, super useful, great idea. Applied stupidly, applied in the wrong way, trusted too much, doesn't matter what it is, we'll get ourselves into trouble. And and that's probably the story of the human species, actually taking technologies, trusting them too much, doing stupid things with them, or using them too much. I mean, look at the automobile, and the airplane. Great idea, brilliant things to use. Trouble is, there's too many of us on the planet, and we all want to have a car, and we all want to go on holidays on the planes. And so, it caused a bit of a problem with pollution. The same thing used to happen in London. Everybody wanted a fire. This was before central heating. They all had coal fires. It caused the most horrific pollution and smog in London. It killed thousands. They don't use them anymore. So, okay, maybe we learn as human beings, but it does feel like, sadly, despite again and again human beings inventing technologies, misusing them, overusing them for certain things, using them for the wrong things, killing a lot of ourselves, and then realizing, oh, maybe we shouldn't have done that. Despite doing that again and again, we still have to make the same mistakes with every new technology. So I don't know. Deep learning is just, or AI is just another technology. It's a nice idea. You push it to its limits, you'll see what it can do. Misuse it, it's not going to be a good thing.
It's funny that you talk about this sort of cyclical nature of, a lot of hype being put into something, not just AI right now, or as it was in the past in the 1950s, but just transformative technologies in general. And this sort of reminds me of the sort of analysis that you wrote for the European Parliament. Correct me if I'm describing this wrong, but you wrote a piece called "Should We Fear Artificial Intelligence" in 2018 for the European Parliament for their science and technology options assessment, where you pretty much echoed the same sentiment, saying that history tells us that the hype is the reason why AI research dives into periods of recession, because large claims lead to big publicity, which lead to big investment and new regulations, and then it doesn't live up to the hype, and the investment dries up, and then it stifles innovation again. So given all that, do you think we might be in for another AI winter?
Well, normally I'd say yes, but we're in a funny time right now. The world is not as predictable as it used to be. So, before we were going through very clear cycles. This time round, the hype has never been so big. The funding has never been so big. we've never had so many researchers all looking at the same thing. And we've never had so many major companies kind of investing so heavily and almost putting this AI as the central tenet of their existence or their futures. However, I think a lot of arguments made, during the hype periods are always similar. So they always show an exponential going up and saying, look, it doesn't matter what it is, whether it's processor speed or the growth of something's exponential. They find something to plot that's exponential, and then they go forwards a few years and say, yeah, in 20 years we'll have AGI. In 50 years we'll have AGI. It's just look at the curve. It's inevitable. It's just you follow it up. It's going and by the way, you go a bit further up. Look, it must go vertical because that's the trend. And what happens when it goes vertical? Well, you've got a singularity, and then suddenly the world explodes. That is just again sloppy thinking, because what they're looking at is the beginning of the curve. And the beginning of any of these curves looks exponential. But if you look at population growth curves in biological systems, actually it's sinusoidal. And so, or to put it another way, it's sinusoidal at best. In some cases, at best, it can be limited by the carrying capacity of an environment, right? So, typically when a population starts rising, it'll hit a certain limit, and then what you'll see is, at best, it'll kind of fluctuate around that limit. And that's the kind of carrying capacity for that thing, whatever it is. So you see this in biological systems, you see it in pretty much everything else. Like when a company creates a new product and they want to dominate the market, or what does a company do when it has dominated the market? Well, it's hit the carrying capacity of that market, and all it can do is fluctuate around the top of it. So what I'm saying is, in reality, there are no singularities. There are no forever verticals. There's a carrying capacity. There's a limit to everything. Because, unless this universe is infinite and there's an infinite amount of matter and an infinite amount of time and an infinite amount of resources, which I'm not sure. I think the verdict's out on that one, but I don't think there is. Therefore, there is a limit. And we also know through basic computation theory, there is there is no one algorithm that can outperform all other algorithms for all tasks. In other words, there's a limit to all algorithms too. So whatever the algorithm is, at some point you hit kind of its ceiling. You hit the point that it can do about as well as it can do. And whilst you can try and push as many more resources in as you can, and you can try and push as much money in as you can, and you can try and tweak the algorithms as much as you can, in the end, you're just slightly nudging that ceiling up, but the ceiling is still there. So, the point is that, I think all of these methods should be thought of as good for something in the right case, in the right place. But I suppose, as I was saying back in that article, I think this notion that I don't know. Maybe I worded it better in what you just read out, but I find it frustrating. Let's say this talk of singularities. I find it frustrating that people don't understand that this is actually fundamental laws of physics. Mm-hmm. There are limits to everything, and will this turn into a severe AI winter? I think that depends on how maturely we look at what's currently happening and whether we can withstand the hype and accept the fact that what we're creating will be very useful, will have some great applications, but it will not solve all of mankind's problems. And in another decade, there'll be a new kind of AI, which may be a variation of what we've got now, or it may be something entirely different, but it'll work better for certain applications. It'll be more efficient. It'll do something better. And that ceiling that we will be finding, and we kind of are finding around now in the next few years, will be in a different place. But if we don't keep our heads together, and when we start hitting the ceiling and we realize that, okay, all these autonomous driving vehicles, well, maybe it's not going to be quite as good as we thought it was, and maybe all these other promises that were made are maybe not quite going to go quite as well as we thought they were going to. We could still have an AI winter if the investors really get a bit unhappy about stuff. It's possible.
So, yeah, I share your reservations about perhaps pursuing technology without a goal, or kind of doing something without knowing the meaning of it. And I suppose I was hoping we could end on perhaps a more general question, which is, what do you think is worth doing? Not just for a computer scientist, just for a human in general. I know it's a kind of an absurd philosophical question, but I'm interested in it. What do you think?
Well, so I think it was a quote by Hamming. So Richard Hamming, if you don't know what Hamming achieved, look him up as a computer. In computer science, everybody should know about Hamming. But I think it was Hamming. I have very bad memory for names, so it's possible I've got it wrong. But I think it was Hamming, who basically said he used to go and sit at different scientists' tables at lunch and listen to them chat and talk about their very complicated problems they were solving. And then after a while, he would ask them, okay, so what's the most important problem in your field? And they would invariably say some other problem. And then he'd say, okay, so it sounds to me like you're not working on this problem. Why is that? Why aren't you working on the most important problem of your field? And then they generally didn't like him after that and wanted him to go away. But that's probably my answer. And that's not to say that I don't fall into the same trap as a scientist, because I do. There's always another little problem here, or an interesting thing that's just popped up, or something that, someone just asked me, well, maybe, or I just want to do one extra thing on what I was last doing, because I just think I could make it do this extra thing, rather than sometimes standing back and thinking, well, okay, look, in my field, there are fundamental problems, and not just in the field, in the world, there are fundamental problems that my field might be able to address. And they could be scientific, they could be environmental, they could be to do with medicine, they could be to do with exploration, they could be, whatever they are, there are some fundamental problems, some fundamental questions. Yet standing back and thinking, well, what is really significant to me? What's something that I think I'd really like to address? What really would be a fundamental problem? And then doing that. So, that
for you,
for me, what's the answer? Well, look, I started. I was a kid. Growing up with the home computers, and I grew up with a weird fascination of biological systems, and I was writing evolving algorithms before I'd ever heard of a genetic algorithm, and I was evolving little swarming things and flocking things before I'd heard of a flocking algorithm. And then I got to my PhD and I had this continuation of this question. And I suppose the question has always been, well, look, I'm not a religious person, but I see all around me the most unbelievable complexity. I see this extraordinary diversity of living systems, this what appears to be designed, but I don't believe a conscious entity designed it. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't believe so. I think it's a natural process. I think it's almost like the laws of physics. Somehow, instead of making it, instead of things dissipating into chaos, they actually come together into order. Somehow you have spontaneous creation of complexity and order. Am I just a complicated chemical reaction? In some respects, I am. But how does that happen? How can a chemical reaction look like a human being, or look like a rabbit, or look like a dinosaur? How could that be? How could that happen? What could make this kind of order and pattern and complexity happen? And those were the questions I had from a very early age, and I suppose those are the questions I still have. So for me, life is precious. Life is a miracle. I love to look at living systems and see the complexity and see the way they're perfectly adapted to their environments. And I just think that's unbelievable. And it's a great shame human beings have destroyed it all, by the way. But I just think it's unbelievable that what we have around us, far better than any technology we've ever created. And yet we have an opportunity now with our clever technology to try and understand this better, to try and cherish the precious living systems that are around us and that are us. So for me, that's my fundamental question. That's what's driven me from an early age. Does that mean I'm going to solve the problem? Almost certainly not, because the older I get, the more I think I know absolutely nothing. It's rather sad. When you're in your 20s, you think you know everything. And when you get a bit older, you realize you know absolutely nothing. So for me, that's the important question. And I wish more people would look at it, because I think we still, as a species, we know nothing really about who we are and what we are and why we are. And wouldn't it be nice if we did know a little bit more? Maybe we would look after it a bit better.
That's a brilliant answer. And I think that's something we can end on.